The fluorescent lights hummed their electric dirge as Katie Rodriguez stepped into Mercy General's ICU at 6:22 a.m., her badge catching the harsh white glow. 8 months. She'd been a civilian nurse for 8 months, and the weight of invisibility had become almost bearable, the way she preferred it. Moving through the wards with quiet competence that should have earned respect, she instead earned something else entirely, the nervous attention of Dr. Marcus Hargrove, who watched her the way a predator watches a mouse that moved too purposefully through the grass. She didn't know he was afraid of her yet. The hospital smelled like every hospital smells, antiseptic and regret mixed with a metallic tang of blood and hope. Katie had walked through worse. She had moved through operating theaters at forward bases where the ground shook from incoming fire, where the only light came from a headlamp strapped to her forehead, and she'd kept hands steady enough to place a needle directly into a combat casualty's pericardial sac while 155mm rounds walked their way across the compound. That had been a different life. That had been when she'd had a name that wasn't Katie Rodriguez, when she'd carried a rank that mattered, when she'd known exactly who she was supposed to be. The old wound in her left side ached as she walked, a familiar complaint left behind by shrapnel in Helmand Province that the official paperwork said never existed. She moved through it without flinching. Pain was information. Pain was just the body keeping score. Room for 12 held a young Marine named Corporal Davis, 22 years old, sharp eyes, the kind of careful stillness that only came from having been broken and welded back together. Katie had read his chart 3 times during night shifts: IED blast 2 years prior, left leg amputation below the knee, ongoing complications with phantom limb pain and the muscle tissue around his prosthetic socket. He was at Mercy General for a dressing change on an infection that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Katie had noticed the billing irregularities on his chart. Procedures coded and charged that never appeared in the actual medical record. The phantom procedures had phantom costs. Someone was stealing. Someone was stealing from a Marine. She adjusted his for pump with movements so practiced they looked like meditation. The antiseptic wipe in her hand released its sharp chemical scent as she prepped the dressing site. "You ever been to Sanjin?" Corporal Davis asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual weight that only soldiers use. Katie didn't pause. "Long time ago." "Yeah, well." Davis shifted his weight on the bed, reaching for his left forearm as the old dressing came away. "I got carried out of Sanjin Valley by the bravest person I've ever met. Female Navy corpsman. Medevac was 12 hours out, and she just carried me. For miles through Helmand with fire coming from 3 sides. I never saw her face. Smoke everywhere. Blood everywhere. But she had this tattoo on her neck, and it said K. Rodriguez." Katie's hands didn't move. They didn't tremble. They applied the new dressing with the precision of someone who had performed this action thousands of times, and thousands of times before that. The gauze went down. The tape followed. Everything in place. "That's remarkable," she said quietly. Her voice was deferential, respectful. The voice of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "You should try to find her. Express your gratitude." "Been trying for 2 years, Davis said. "Navy won't release service records. It's like she doesn't exist anymore." Katie finished the dressing change in silence and moved toward the door. Her hands had started to shake, not from fear, not from emotion, but from the particular tremor that comes from holding something back with such force that your muscles burn. She controlled it before she reached the threshold. "I'm sure you'll find her," Katie said without turning around. Remarkable people have a way of turning up. Dr. Hargrove was waiting at the nurse's station when she finished her morning rounds. He had noticed things. Hargrove always noticed things, just not the right things. He noticed that Katie read charts completely. He noticed that she cross-referenced medication logs with billing codes. He noticed that her notepad had more than 1 page of handwritten observations about procedures that appeared on invoices but not in actual patient care documentation. What he didn't notice was that his fear tasted like copper in the air between them. Katie set Corporal Davis's updated chart on the desk with careful precision. Hargrove's jaw tightened as he watched her hand move away from the file. His eyes were small. She had always thought his eyes were small, like a man who'd never learned to see anything larger than himself. "You know, Rodriguez," he said, keeping his voice low so the rest of the nursing staff wouldn't hear, "we have protocols for a reason. Nursing staff shouldn't be making notes about billing procedures. That's above your pay grade." Katie met his eyes for exactly 1 second. The kind of look you give someone when you're deciding whether they're a threat or just background noise. She decided years ago, background noise. "Of course, doctor," she said. She didn't mention the phantom procedures again. Not that day. She would document it differently, quietly, thoroughly, in a way that couldn't be unseen once someone who actually cared looked at the evidence. But that wasn't her job here. Her job was to disappear. Her job was to be Katie Rodriguez, just a nurse at Mercy General, the quiet one nobody remembered, the one who never caused problems. Her locker sat in the far corner of the break room, away from the main activity. During her lunch, 40 minutes that she spent not eating but instead sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair by the window, Katie opened the metal door and looked at the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket. The patch was nearly invisible if you didn't know to look for it. Olive drab fabric worn almost grey, the insignia still clear enough to read if you held it under good light, 5th Fleet Naval Medical, JSOC attached, the seahorse and trident unit symbol that had been her entire world before the extraction went sideways in Yemen. That patch was all she'd kept. Everything else had been classified away, shredded, erased. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez didn't exist anymore. There were no records. No photographs. No official acknowledgement that she had ever performed pericardiocentesis on a cardiac tamponade patient during a firefight, or that she had kept 3 hostages alive in a Yemen safe house for 40 hours with minimal supplies and maximum hemorrhage control, or that the diplomat the Navy publicly denied they'd been trying to extract had walked out of there alive because of her hands and her knowledge and her absolute refusal to accept failure. All of that had been buried. That was the price of the black op gone sideways, the price of the diplomat never supposed to be in country, the price of the Navy protecting diplomatic relations over truth. Katie had signed the paperwork that erased her. She had nodded when they explained the new life. She had taken the civilian identity and walked into it like a ghost. She touched the patch once, her fingers barely brushing the fabric, and then closed the locker. The metal door swung shut with a soft click that sounded like a vault ceiling. The afternoon shift started with the kind of mundane chaos that hospitals specialized in. Vitals needed checking. Medications needed administering. A patient in room 408 had developed a fever, 101.3 degrees, her thermometer read, and Katie made a note to flag it for the attending. Another phantom procedure on another chart caught her eye. Someone at Mercy General was very busy billing for care that never happened. By the time Katie clocked out at 6:15 p.m., the San Diego heat had settled over the parking lot like a living thing. The sky was already turning that peculiar shade of orange it took on in late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look like it was burning. She walked to her car, a 2006 Honda Civic, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that no one would ever remember seeing, and sat in the driver's seat before starting the engine. Her phone was a smartphone, nothing special, factory settings. But the contact list included one number that shouldn't have existed, a line that connected directly to a Pentagon extension that wasn't listed in any official directory. That number was there in case of emergency. In case the erasure failed. In case someone came looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez and found something that mattered. She hadn't used it in 8 months. Katie drove home through San Diego traffic with the window down and the radio off, listening to the sounds of the city, horns and sirens and the particular mechanical hum of a city full of people living regular lives. She thought about Corporal Davis and the tattoo he carried on his forearm. She thought about the phantom procedures on the charts. She thought about Dr. Hargrove's small eyes and his carefully concealed fear. And she thought about the unit patch in her locker, waiting for a day when invisibility wouldn't be enough anymore. That day was coming. She didn't know it yet, but the rain that would fall 2 days from now was already building somewhere out over the Pacific, gathering its force, preparing to wash away everything she'd built in 8 months of careful not being anyone. For now, she was just a nurse. That's what everyone at Mercy General believed. That's what she'd trained herself to accept. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The morning rounds at Mercy General began like every morning, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of exhaustion, the antiseptic smell of a place where suffering got catalogued and filed. Katie moved through the corridors with a chart tucked against her chest, her scrub still crisp at 0730 hours, though that would change by noon. Room for 12 was 3 doors down from the nurse's station, and she'd already checked Corporal Davis's vitals at 06 for 5, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation 96%, pain controlled at a 3. She was explaining his discharge instructions when Dr. Hargrove materialized beside her like a shadow that had learned to breathe. He was tall, that kind of height that made other men straighten their spines around him, and his white coat was so white it hurt to look at directly. His name was embroidered in script, the letters perfectly precise, like someone had engraved his superiority into the fabric. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, his voice the temperature of a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning. "Did you administer the 0800 antibiotics at 0820? Katie turned. Corporal Davis's mother stood at the bedside, her hand resting on her son's foot. The Marine himself was watching with the kind of focus soldiers develop when they sense danger. "Yes, doctor," Katie said, her voice level as water. The timing was appropriate given the patient's glucose levels needed stabilization first. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The muscle worked once, twice. "Are you contradicting me in front of a patient's family?" "This is exactly why I call you clipboard. You follow protocols like a robot without understanding actual medicine." Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath they teach you before you go into a firefight, before you have to perform field surgery on someone whose name you'll never know. She held it for 4 seconds, then let it out through her nose. The medication interaction with his diabetic profile. "Your shift ends at 1900, Hargrove interrupted, turning to Corporal Davis's mother. "I apologize for our nurse's confusion about basic pharmacology." A single tear escaped Katie's left eye. Just one. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving like someone swatting away an insect. "I've survived worse than your insecurity, doctor," she said, her voice so quiet the mother had to lean forward to catch it. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's face shifted through 3 colors, red, then purple, then a white so pale it matched his coat. He turned on his heel and left without another word, but Katie could feel the thing he'd set in motion, the way a hunter feels the trap spring close behind them. 2 hours later, she pushed through the break room door with her coffee, black, strong enough to strip paint, the same brand she'd been drinking since her last deployment to Kandahar. 4 nurses were sitting at the table by the window. They were talking about something, some gossip about the radiology department, but the conversation died the instant she walked in. Not faded. Died. Like someone had switched off a light. Katie pulled out a chair at the corner table. The scrape of the legs against the linoleum sounded like something breaking. Within 30 seconds, all 4 nurses stood. One made an excuse about the medication room, a lie. Katie could hear it like a lie had a specific pitch. Another said she was due back in pediatrics. The 3rd and 4th simply left, their chairs scraping louder than hers had, as if they wanted her to know it was deliberate. She sat alone, her hand steady around the coffee cup, watching the steam rise. The brew was still too hot to drink. She could have waited. Katie Rodriguez had learned patience in places where impatience got people killed. But she also understood that waiting alone in a room was different from waiting alone in an ambush position. In one, you were gathering intelligence. In the other, you were just being left behind. By early afternoon, when she checked the unit board where the staff posted schedule changes and announcements, it was there. A sheet of white paper, printed in 12-point font, posted with the kind of tape that came off medical equipment. It read, "Written warning, K. Rodriguez, insubordination and medication timing violations. Failure to comply with attending physician direction. Further incidents will result in immediate termination." Dr. L. Hargrove, attending physician. Katie read it twice. The first time to understand the words. The second time to understand what he'd done. He'd made it public. Every nurse who came to check the schedule would see it. Every resident, every student, every family member who wandered past. The humiliation was the point. The fabrication was just the architecture. The other nurses walked past her throughout the afternoon, and none of them met her eyes. The charge nurse, Margaret Chen, who had made Katie tea when she'd had a migraine 2 weeks ago, suddenly became very interested in the medication cart. The weight of it settled across her shoulders like body armor made of lead. At 1,430 hours, Katie was doing a dressing change in room for 12. Corporal Davis watched her work with that particular intensity soldiers develop, the ability to read a person's entire emotional state through the angle of their shoulders and the speed of their hands. She was changing the sterile gauze on his surgical site, her movements economical and precise, when he spoke. "I got this tattoo in 2019, he said, extending his forearm. Ink covered the skin there, dark, professional work, a name rendered in block letters 3 inches long. Kate Rodriguez." Katie's hands paused. Not for long. Half a second. The kind of pause that only existed if you were looking for it. "A Navy corpsman carried me for miles through Helmand Province after an IED blast," Davis continued, his voice reverent in the way that only comes when you're talking about someone who saved your life. "It was an operation outside Sanjin. We took contact from the South Ridge, and I caught shrapnel in my left leg and abdomen. She applied a tourniquets, 2 of them, kept me talking, kept me conscious when I wanted to slip. Never saw her face through all the blood and smoke, but I owed her my life. Still do. So when I made it stateside, I got this. Figure if I ever meet her, she'll know." The sterile technique continued. Katie's hands moved on muscle memory alone, memory older than her civilian identity, older than the 8 months she'd spent at Mercy General pretending to be someone else. The hands belonged to someone else entirely. "The corpsman must have been remarkable," Katie said, and the words came out steady, because they were true. She had been remarkable. She still was. That person just didn't exist anymore, not officially, not in any record that could be accessed. She excused herself before her hands could betray her, before the muscle memory could take over completely and she could say the words she'd been trained never to say. In the supply closet 3 doors down, she leaned against the cold metal shelving and breathed. The air smelled like latex and antiseptic, sterile and empty. She thought about Helmand Province, about the weight of a marine across her shoulders, about the sound a tourniquet makes when you tighten it with someone's blood already coating your fingers. She thought about how she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life and how she'd done it perfectly, and how none of that mattered because the dead were still dead, and the living were still walking around with her name tattooed on their skin, and the only thing she'd managed to accomplish was becoming someone new enough that nobody recognized her when she tried. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2,147 hours on a Tuesday night when Katie was checking vitals in the ICU and the security doors burst open like something had detonated on the other side. The man who came through was maybe 35, skeletal thin, with the particular intensity that comes from 3 days without sleep and chemicals flooding a nervous system that no longer knew how to regulate itself. His pupils were dilated to the size of nickels. His jaw worked constantly, chewing at nothing. And in his right hand was a Glock 19, the barrel reflecting the fluorescent lights like a mirror showing something that wasn't supposed to exist in a hospital. "You killed him," the man screamed, his voice cracking on the second word. "You fucking killed my brother." Katie was in room for 08, checking the fluid line on an elderly woman with congestive heart failure. She heard the gunshots before she consciously registered the sound, 2 bursts, rapid fire, the way someone shoots when they've never been trained and panic overrides everything else. The ceiling tiles rained down like plaster snow. She moved into the hallway. The gunman was 40 feet away, near the central nurses' station, and his weapon was swinging toward room for 12. Toward Corporal Davis's bed. The Marine was in traction, his legs suspended in a complex system of pulleys and steel, unable to move faster than a crawl. His eyes were wide, not with fear but with recognition. He'd seen this kind of death before, in other deserts, under other skies. Katie's civilian identity shattered like a dropped vial. Her body moved before her brain could catalogue the decision. 15 years of combat training doesn't sleep. It waits. It lives in your muscle tissue, in the neural pathways that connect thought to action, and when the moment comes, it wakes up with the fury of something that's been caged and starved. She stepped directly into the bullet's trajectory. The muzzle flash came with a sound like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. The impact hit her left shoulder and spun her body sideways, driving her into the wall with enough force to crack the drywall. The pain was white-hot and immediate, familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. She'd been shot before, in a village outside Sana'a, in an operation that never officially happened. The wound was in her chart only as training accident. The mission didn't exist. The blood spread across her blue scrubs, hot and wet, soaking the cotton. She looked down at it for the quarter second her mind allowed, registered the arterial spray pattern, calculated that she had maybe 4 minutes before the pressure would become critical. Then her hands moved with the kind of purpose that came from somewhere older and darker than Mercy General, somewhere the military had spent 8 years teaching her to be a weapon that could think. She used the momentum of the impact to launch herself at the gunman, her body moving with terrifying fluid precision. The disarm came in 3 moves: redirect the weapon, control the wrist, strike the nerve cluster beneath his thumb. The gun clattered to the floor 4.2 seconds after the first shot, though nobody would know that until they reviewed the security footage later. Katie held the gunman face down on the linoleum, her uninjured hand pressing his arm into submission, her breathing controlled and even. Security arrived at 2,150 hours, and she released him without a word. Dr. Hargrove watched from the safety of the medication room 20 feet away, his face the color of spoiled milk, and Katie realized in that moment that he was calculating. He was already planning, already figuring out which board members owed him which favors, already rehearsing the story he would tell them. He'd just watched a nurse step into a bullet and disarm an attacker, and instead of seeing a hero, he saw an opportunity. He saw a threat with no protection. Tuesday night at 11:38 p.m., the ICU doors burst open. Travis Kendrick, 23, pupils dilated black, jaw clenched so tight his temples pulsed, came through them firing. Not wild, panicked shots. Controlled. Methodical. His brother had died on this floor at 6:15 p.m. from complications Katie had nothing to do with, but methamphetamine doesn't care about facts. It only knows rage. The first shot punched through the window of room for 12. Glass exploded. Monitors screamed. A nurse on the east wing ran toward the exits. Another dove behind the medication cart. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. Corporal Davis's ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as his hand twitched, awake, aware, unable to move. His eyes tracked the sound of gunfire with the calculated precision of someone who'd learned to survive in Helmand Province. He knew what incoming sounded like. He knew what it meant. Katie was in room for 14, checking a post-op patient's chest tube when she heard the first shot. Not the sharp crack most people imagine. Louder. Deeper. A sound that triggers something ancient in the human nervous system, something that lives in the brainstem and remembers when gunfire meant death was 30 yards away. She moved. Not toward safety. Toward the gun. The next shot came through room 412's window, and Katie saw Kendrick's trajectory like she was reading a tactical map. Saw where his body was angled. Saw where room for 12 was. Saw where Corporal Davis lay in that bed, ribs wrapped, still on the ventilator, utterly unable to defend himself. The third shot was already chambering when Katie stepped out of room for 14 with her hands open and her eyes locked on the gunman's shoulder. The gun swung toward Davis's bed. Katie moved into its path. The bullet entered her left shoulder 2 inches below the clavicle at 11:49 p.m., approximately 1.3 inches above where the brachial artery carried blood to her forearm. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer wrapped in lightning. It spun her into the wall hard enough that she felt drywall dust coat the back of her neck. Blood spread across her scrubs, her own blood, pouring hot and urgent, soaking through cotton until the pale blue uniform looked like someone had painted it crimson. She didn't scream. She didn't fall. She breathed once, assessed the damage like she was evaluating a wounded insurgent at a forward operating base, and registered that she was still mobile. Still capable. Still here. Kendrick's eyes widened. He'd shot someone. The realization took 3/4 of a second to process through the methamphetamine haze. 3/4 of a second was enough. Katie's hands moved on their own. Combat reflex. Muscle memory that had been trained into her nervous system over 15 years of trauma medicine in field conditions. She crossed the 8 feet between them in 1.4 seconds, moving like apex predators move, silent, economical, utterly lethal. She hit his shooting side wrist with a palm strike that drove upward through his hand, and the gun went flying. It skittered across the tile floor and came to rest near the supply station, useless now. Kendrick tried to pivot, tried to reach for something on his hip, but Katie was already inside his reach. She pivoted on her right foot and drove her left elbow toward his solar plexus with the kind of precision that comes from having practiced it against actual opponents, not punching bags. The air exploded out of his lungs. He dropped. She kicked his legs out from under him and he went down hard, impact shaking the floor. She was on him before he could process it, wrist control, pressure on the brachial nerve, her knee positioned exactly where it needed to be to pin his lower body while keeping her weight distributed to maintain balance. 3 moves. 7 seconds. The security footage later would look like a training demonstration because it was a training demonstration, executed by someone who had trained to execute it while under actual fire. The ICU had gone quiet except for the sound of monitors and the ventilator attached to Corporal Davis. A nurse appeared from behind the medication cart, phone already in hand. Security officers arrived at 11:51 p.m., and Katie released Kendrick without resistance, her hands open and empty, blood dripping from her scrubs onto the tile floor in a steady pattern like a hospital metronome. That's when she felt it, the real pain. Not sharp. Clinical. Pain as data. Pain as information. She'd been shot through the shoulder, and her body had run on adrenaline and instinct for those 7 seconds, but now the adrenaline was crashing and her nervous system was sending urgent messages. The bullet had gone clean through. Through and through. She could feel the exit wound on her back, could feel the hot spread of blood there too, could count her pulse by the throbbing in her shoulder like someone was driving nails into her collarbone in rhythm with her heartbeat. A male voice, "Katie, sit down." She didn't recognize him immediately. Dark eyes. South Asian features. Dr. Chen, the ER trauma surgeon. When had he arrived? She didn't remember calling anyone. "I can walk," Katie said. Her voice sounded normal. Steady. She hated how easily the medical professional in her could separate from the wounded woman. Hated how she could assess her own vital signs like she was reading someone else's chart. "You're shot. You're going to the ER. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from someone who'd made that decision 1,000 times and trusted their own judgment completely. Katie nodded once and moved toward the elevator, leaving a trail of blood drops on the tile floor behind her, a pattern that would later be photographed for the incident report. The ER trauma bay was controlled chaos. Dr. Chen moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who'd spent 10,000 hours making life-or-death decisions in real time. Nurses positioned the trauma cart. Someone cut away her scrubs. Someone started and fore with a 20-gauge needle that went in smooth and clean. The fluorescent lights overhead were too bright. Her vision kept wanting to tunnel, but she pulled it back, kept her eyes open, kept tracking every movement. 2 minutes, a nurse said. "You're bleeding out." "No, I'm not," Katie said. Her voice was ice. "Exit wound on the back is actually smaller than the entry. Looks like a clean through and through. Brachial arteries intact. No tension in my breathing. No subcutaneous air I can feel. Bullet tracked right through the soft tissue. Lucky. Very lucky. Dr. Chen looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Something flickered in his expression, professional assessment crossing with something harder to define. A man recognizing that the person on his table was not an ordinary civilian nurse. How do you know that? He said. Medical training. He didn't ask follow-up questions. Good trauma surgeons learn to focus on what matters. He positioned the ultrasound probe over her shoulder and scanned the wound with the precise movements of someone checking for internal bleeding. The grayscale image appeared on the screen, blood pooling in the subcutaneous tissue but no catastrophic damage to major vessels. Okay, Dr. Chen said. We're going to irrigate the wound, check for debris, and close it. I want to use something stronger than local for this. Local's fine, Katie said. You're shot. Take the sedation. Local. Please. He looked at her again. This time longer. This time the professional assessment included elements of recognition, the kind of look someone gets when they've just realized they're not talking to a person who processes pain the way ordinary people do. Local, he said to the nurse. Then to Katie, if you move, if you flinch, if you so much as twitch, I'm stopping and getting the anesthesia cart. Understood. Understood. The 1% lidocaine went in first, a small syringe with a fine needle. Katie felt the pinprick, felt the burning spread as the local anesthetic started working, deadening the nerves in a 4-inch radius around the wound. By the time Dr. Chen came back with the surgical irrigation kit and the through-and-through sutures, the pain had transformed into pressure and numbness. He opened the wound wider, sterile saline irrigation flowing out of the pulsed pressure system, washing away blood and tissue debris. Katie watched the monitor showing her vital signs. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure low normal. She'd lost probably 400 to 500 milliliters of blood by now. The body could compensate for that for a while, but not forever. Through and through, Dr. Chen said, more to himself than to her. Missed the brachial by maybe 8 millimeters. 8 millimeters to the left and you die in the trauma bay. 8 millimeters to the right and you lose the arm. You are, statistically speaking, one of the luckiest people I've ever operated on. Or one of the smartest, Katie said. Stepped right into the path of the incoming. Controlled the variables. He looked up from the wound. You stepped into a bullet on purpose. Patient needed protection. Gunman had clear line of sight. He was adjusting his aim. Dr. Chen went back to work, but his jaw tightened. The kind of jaw tightening that comes from understanding the implications of what had just been said. A civilian nurse doesn't step into gunfire on purpose. A civilian nurse doesn't assess ballistics angles. A civilian nurse doesn't talk about controlling variables when they've just been shot. But he didn't ask questions. He worked. The sutures went in with mechanical precision, interrupted 3-0 nylon, each knot cinched tight enough to hold but not so tight it would compromise circulation. By the time he finished, Katie's shoulder looked like a trauma bay reconstruction, which was exactly what it was. The bandaging was immaculate. The bleeding had stopped. You need to stay for observation, Dr. Chen said. Minimum 6 hours. Could be infection risk. Could be late bleeds. You're staying. Okay. And Katie. He said it quietly, a voice that didn't carry to the other staff members. Whoever you really are. Whatever happened here tonight. That was extraordinary. He left before she could answer. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. 3 floors above, Dr. Hargrove was already on the phone. 2 days. 48 hours since the bullet. Katie stood at Mount Soledad Veterans Memorial in the rain, her shoulder screaming under the weight of the bandage, her dress uniform soaked through where the rain found the stitches. The granite headstone was slick beneath her palm. Marcus Rodriguez. 1987 to 2019, husband. Father. Marine. The cemetery was empty. Just the dead and the woman who couldn't save her husband from an aneurysm but could step in front of a bullet for a stranger's son. The logic of it made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. I made it through 15 years of combat medicine, Marcus. Her voice cracked on the second word. She let it crack. No one was listening. 15 years. Helmand Province. Yemen. I kept people alive in places where the walls were bleeding from shrapnel. I performed a pericardiocentesis during a firefight. Do you remember? I called you after, from the FOB, and I was shaking so bad I couldn't hold the sat phone. You said you held steady when it mattered. That's the only time steady counts. Rain pooled in the grooves of the granite. She traced his name with her finger. And I couldn't make it 15 months as a regular nurse, Marcus. 15 months. One man with a clipboard and a god complex, and I'm gone. I failed. The rain hammered harder, each drop hitting like a small accusation. She thought about the Yemen operation, the basement in Sana'a where the walls sweat and the dust tastes like copper. 40 hours. 3 hostages. 1 field surgical kit designed for emergencies, not for what she'd had to do. She'd performed a resuscitative hysterotomy on a pregnant Foreign Service officer whose heart had stopped from massive hemorrhage. A procedure meant for a delivery room, executed in a basement while automatic weapons fire rattled the concrete above. The woman survived. The baby survived. Katie had been shot through the shoulder for her trouble, but that was acceptable. That was the job. This wasn't the job. Being fired wasn't the job. Being erased the second time, once by the Navy, once by Mercy General, that was something else entirely. She kneeled in the rain for another hour, saying nothing. The pain in her shoulder was nothing. The pain in her chest was everything. At home that evening, Miguel found her sitting in the dark, still in the wet uniform. Her 16-year-old son, who'd inherited her quiet composure and her father's ability to see what needed doing, stood in the doorway with an expression that made her sit up straight. "Mom, there's something I need to show you." He'd gone to the attic. Found the box. The shadow box she'd kept wrapped in plastic and hidden behind the insulation since they'd moved to San Diego. 23 months ago. She'd told herself she'd destroyed everything. Burned the papers. Erased the past. But she'd kept the medals. That was the failure right there. She'd tried to kill the past and she'd kept the most valuable pieces of it. Miguel didn't ask questions. He just showed her the FOIA forms he'd submitted online. He showed her the responses, somehow routed through the right channels, somehow unlocked from the classified blocks. He showed her that he'd called a number she didn't know he had, a number from an old email address in a drawer she thought he'd never seen, and talked to someone named Reeves who'd listened and said yes. They need to see this, Miguel said. They need to understand what you are. The next morning, Katie was closing her locker. The locker she should never have had, the job she should never have taken, the life she should never have tried to live. Her shoulder throbbed in a way that made the physical therapy exercises feel like penance. She was thinking about applying to veterinary schools, something solitary, something where you didn't have to talk to people, something that didn't require you to pretend. Her phone buzzed. A text from Miguel, "They're waiting." The administrative conference room was on the 4th floor. She'd been there once during orientation, when they'd made her watch a video about workplace safety. The room felt smaller than she remembered. Narrower. Like the walls were closing on decisions made by people who'd never had to decide anything that mattered. Miguel was standing at the end of a mahogany table. The board members were seated in leather chairs that probably cost more than Katie's monthly salary. Dr. Hargrove was there, wearing his white coat like armor. His expression was the expression of a man who'd never been questioned in his life. Miguel opened the shadow box. The silence was absolute. Not the heavy silence of a hospital waiting room where people were dying. This was a different silence, the silence of assumptions being murdered. Rows of ribbons. Blue velvet. 2 bronze stars. A purple heart mounted below them. Commendation medals. Ribbons she'd earned in countries that didn't appear on maps. "Mom, they need to understand what you did," Miguel said. His voice didn't shake. He'd inherited that from her too. Dr. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. The board chairman, Williams, his name was Williams, leaned forward like he was watching something that might bite him. The head nurse, Maria Santos, picked up Katie's personnel file. The real one. The one Miguel had somehow obtained. Her hands trembled as she read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, United States Navy. She looked up at Katie, and her eyes were wet. 20 formal commendations. Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. Top of your class. The door opened with the kind of authority that comes from military bearing. Commander Jack Reeves walked in wearing his service khakis, and Katie's breath caught because she knew him. She'd worked with him in Helmand Province. He'd been bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his thigh when she'd found him, and she'd wrapped the wound while rounds impacted the compound wall, and he'd said, "Steady hands, Senior Chief," and she'd said, "Pressure on," and that was all the conversation they'd needed. Reeves looked at her once. A nod. Then he turned to the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to provide context for Senior Chief Rodriguez's decorations." He picked up the first bronze star like it was made of something sacred. This was awarded for performing a pericardiocentesis on a Marine with cardiac tamponade during a firefight in Helmand Province. She inserted a needle into his pericardial sac while rounds were impacting our position. The Marine survived because of her hands. Dr. Hargrove tried, "Commander, this is highly irregular." Reeves continued without acknowledging him, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and unstoppable. The second bronze star was for a hostage extraction in Yemen where she kept 3 civilians alive for 40 hours with minimal supplies. I was there. I watched her perform surgery with a headlamp and a field kit while the building was under siege. Watched her steady hands move like she wasn't hearing the gunfire. Williams gripped the table edge. The leather groaned. Why wasn't this in her employment records? The next figure through the door was FBI Special Agent Diana Chen, holding a badge folder that she placed on the mahogany with the weight of finality. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by men in white coats. Senior Chief Rodriguez's service was classified, Chen said. Certain operations required her records to be sealed for national security purposes. She was ordered to maintain civilian cover. That was legal. Chen's eyes moved to Dr. Hargrove like a weapon finding its target. What's not legal is what you did this morning. Hargrove's face went from bone white to the grey of a corpse. We've been investigating your insurance fraud scheme for 6 months, Doctor. When you attempted to forge Senior Chief Rodriguez's termination records this morning to cover your tracks and eliminate a witness who'd noticed your billing discrepancies, you committed a federal crime. Altering documents related to military personnel triggers federal jurisdiction. She opened a folder. Showed him the digital footprints. 3 attempts to access military databases using falsified credentials. Timestamps that put him in his office at 2:27 a.m. doing something that would end his career. Reeves picked up the Purple Heart. His hand was steady, but his jaw was tight in a way that meant he remembered why it had been awarded. This was for injuries sustained during the Yemen operation. She was shot protecting a Foreign Service officer. He looked directly at Hargrove. The woman you fired for protecting a patient has made a career of protecting people. It's what she does. It's who she is. Katie stood at the far end of the table, in the dress uniform that was still damp in places, feeling the weight of the bullet wound like a physical presence, not pain, not anymore, but information. Data. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. One measured breath holding back 15 years of secrets that were no longer secret. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. The room had changed around him. He was no longer the authority in the room. He was the thing being examined. I want a lawyer, he said. Chen smiled without warmth. You're going to need more than one. She was packing her locker when the administrative door opened. Her son Miguel walked through it carrying something she hadn't seen in 16 years, a shadow box, the kind military families used to display medals. Katie's hand stilled on the stack of scrubs she'd been folding. Miguel was 16, lanky in the way teenage boys are, but his jaw was set with something she recognized. Purpose. The same composure she'd spent 15 years trying to erase from her own face. "Mom," he said, voice steady as a command. "They need to see these." The hastily convened board meeting had taken place in the hospital's largest conference room. 14 people sitting around a table that suddenly felt too small. Board Chairman Williams, who'd avoided her eye for 2 days. Simmons, who'd voted to terminate her without reading a single line of her employment record. The head nurse, Maria Santos, whose hands trembled as Miguel opened the shadow box. The fluorescent lights caught the metal as he angled the display forward, rows of ribbons in precise formation, the kind of arrangement that told stories to people who knew how to read them. Bronze Star. The doctors shifted in their seats. Purple Heart. One of the board members made a sound like air escaping from a tire. 2 Purple Hearts. Williams suddenly needed water. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Maria Santos whispered, her voice cracking as she picked up the personnel file she'd been handed minutes earlier. Her hands shook visibly as she read aloud, 20 commendations, graduated top of class at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, 15 deployments, 3 Combat Valor Awards, certified in Advanced Trauma Life Support, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, Special Operations Medicine. The silence in that room was the kind that happens when people realize they've made a catastrophic error. Katie stood in the corner in her civilian clothes, jeans, the faded hoodie she'd worn for 8 months to be invisible, and said nothing. That was always how you handled this moment. You let other people speak first. You let them piece it together. The conference room door opened. A man in dress uniform walked in with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Commander James Reeves, SEAL Team 3, his chest a geography of medals. Miguel had called him. Katie's son, 16 years old, had gone online and found the unit website and picked up the phone and called a number listed for public affairs, and somehow, because that's how it worked when you knew the right words to say, he'd reached the right person. The person who still had Katie's back after all these years. Reeves moved to the front of the room with the terrifying fluid precision of a man who'd cleared rooms in 3 continents. The Bronze Star for Helm and Province, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. Your nurse performed a pericardiocentesis under fire. Patient in cardiac tamponade from shrapnel fragments. She threaded a needle through a chest cavity while rounds were impacting 2 meters away. The patient lived because her hands don't shake under pressure. A board member started to say something. Reeves cut him off with a single glance. The second Bronze Star is classified, Reeves continued. Yemen operation. Hostage extraction. 3 civilians were in shock from untreated wounds. Septic, delirious, expected to be DOA by every medical assessment. Your nurse kept them alive for 40 hours with minimal supplies and no resupply window. Field surgery in a house with no power, no sterile environment, no backup. She kept them breathing. When the extraction team arrived, all 3 were conscious and stable enough to fly. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside. It tapped against the windows like Morse code, like a warning nobody had listened to. She's not just a nurse, Reeves said. She's the nurse. The one people call when protocols don't work and civilians are dying in places that don't officially exist. The door opened again. The woman who entered was FBI, her badge catching the light as she placed it on the table. Agent Chen, Field Crimes Division. She was carrying a folder that looked like it weighed something heavier than paper. We've been investigating Dr. Hargrove's insurance fraud scheme for 6 months, Chen said, and something shifted in the room like a predator entering the space. Phantom procedures. Upcoded treatments. Equipment supplier kickbacks totaling $2,340,000 over 4 years. What made today different is that this morning, at 03 for 7 hours, Dr. Hargrove attempted to access the Defense Logistics Information Service and alter Senior Chief Rodriguez's military records. Federal forgery. He tried to erase her service record to cover his tracks on her termination. When you tamper with DoD personnel files, you trigger automatic alerts to the Pentagon. She paused. Let that land. That's a felony. Multiple felonies. And it brought federal jurisdiction into what was previously a civil matter. Hargrove had been in the building. Katie had heard him in his office that morning, talking on the phone in that confident tone that meant he still thought he was winning. The sound of a man who had no idea the floor was already gone beneath him. 2 federal marshals found him at 1,430 hours in his office, removing items from his desk into a leather briefcase. They placed him in handcuffs with the efficient precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. They walked him through Mercy General's main corridor, the same corridor where he'd stood 2 days ago, talking about reckless nurses and unauthorized interventions, where he'd orchestrated her humiliation with the casual confidence of a man who owned the room. The ICU staff watched him pass. Corporal Davis, mobile now in a wheelchair, stood. The movement took effort, but he did it anyway, and he saluted as Hargrove was escorted past. The sound of the handcuffs was metal on metal, a sound like finality. The break room was where the real conversation happened. Maria Santos was reading aloud from the personnel file to the nurses who'd avoided Katie's eye for 8 months. 15 deployments. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. One nurse whispered, she was doing medication rounds with us, and she'd done surgery in war zones. Another, she stood in front of a bullet. For Corporal Davis. Who, she didn't finish. They all knew what they hadn't seen. What they'd been trained not to see by a man who'd made invisibility a survival skill. The weight of complicity settled over them like anesthesia wearing off. Too late to take back. Too late to change the moment they turned away. 6 weeks later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at a strip mall on the outskirts of San Diego. He was sitting at a folding table with a banner that read supplemental insurance, low rates in printed letters that looked like they'd been done at a UPS store. The cheap suit hung loose on him, the kind of thing a man wore when his tailored wardrobe had been liquidated in a foreclosure. His medical license was suspended pending trial. His house was in the second phase of foreclosure. His wife had filed papers through a lawyer who specialized in divorces where one party had committed federal crimes. Everything he'd built by cutting corners and destroying lives had evaporated like morning fog. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that nobody was watching anymore. He'd built his entire career on being seen, on visibility, on authority, on the power of people remembering his name and what he'd taken from them. Now he was invisible. Actual invisible. The kind of invisible Katie had chosen deliberately, and he'd stumbled into accidentally. 3 months after the shooting, Katie stood in Mercy General's main conference room wearing her navy dress whites. The gold anchors on her collar caught the light from the windows where rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the world looking washed clean and new. The hospital board had reorganized, Williams and Simmons had resigned under investigation, and the new chairman, Dr. Patricia Vance, read from a prepared statement with the careful gravity of someone trying to repair what should never have broken. "We failed Senior Chief Rodriguez," Vance said. "We allowed personal vendettas to override our judgment. Today we hope to begin making that right." They offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. A formal apology. A settlement that could have paid for Miguel's entire undergraduate education if she'd needed it to. She accepted without expression, the way you accept something that was always yours in the first place. Corporal Davis sat in the front row in his marine dress blues. His arm was still in a sling from the gunshot wound, the one he'd taken because he'd been positioned where the bullet found him. When Katie was introduced, he stood, the movement careful but committed, and his eyes changed. Recognition finally clicking into place. The eyes he'd seen through blood and smoke, the steady hands holding him together, the calm voice that had told him he was going to make it while she carried him for miles through Helmand Province. His voice broke when he spoke. "You. It was you." Katie nodded once. A single motion that contained everything. He saluted with tears streaming down his face, and nobody in the room looked away. Commander Reeves pinned the Navy and Marine Corps Medal on her uniform. The award was classified for years but had finally been approved for the Yemen operation. The red ribbon had a white stripe down the center, the design reserved for heroism without fear. Katie received it the way she received everything, with the composure of someone who'd already survived the worst and had decided to keep living anyway. In her acceptance speech, she kept it brief. The way you do when you're used to saying what matters and letting the rest go. I became a nurse to keep serving after I couldn't serve in uniform. Dr. Hargrove taught me that some people see compassion as weakness and competence as threat. He was wrong on both counts. She looked at Miguel in the audience, and something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, Katie had learned softness long ago in her first deployment, but clarity. Purpose that extended beyond survival. My son reminded me that hiding who you are to make others comfortable is its own kind of surrender. I won't do that anymore. She concluded with words Marcus used to say, her late husband, the man who'd understood what it meant to love someone who carried classified memories. True class is what you do when the lights go out. In the ICU, the lights went out. We do what we've always done, we take care of each other. The staff gave her a standing ovation. The sound filled the room like applause, like recognition, like finally being seen. In her new office, Katie hung the faded unit patch from her jacket lining on the wall beside her diplomas and medals. No longer hidden. No longer erased. Finally acknowledged. Through the window, she could see the ICU where Corporal Davis was doing his final physical therapy before discharge, where the job of healing continued, where she'd found a way to serve that didn't require her to disappear into the margins. She'd spent 16 years being invisible. She'd been good at it. Now she was learning something harder, how to be visible and still stand her ground, how to let people know her and not diminish herself in the process, how to be exactly who she was without apology. The rain had stopped outside. The sun was coming back. And for the first time since she'd accepted her discharge papers, Katie Rodriguez was done running. If Katie's story resonated with you, please share this video and help us celebrate the hidden heroes all around us, the ones who serve without fanfare, who heal without recognition, who stay strong in the quiet places where nobody's watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, resilience, and the moment everything changes. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength? Let's talk about it.